President Emmanuel Macron of France has made no secret of his desire for Europe and France to take on a greater role on the international stage. His visit to China can be seen as another example of his ambition to cement his position as a global statesman. But at home, protests against his controversial pension reforms are putting him under intense political pressure. Thursday saw the 11th day of nationwide protests and strikes. Demonstrators stormed the offices of a major financial multinational in Paris to protest against Macron's plan to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the country again. Protesters have vowed to continue the demonstrations until Macron agrees to put the plan on hold. We can now speak to Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. She's a French journalist who works for the Telegraph and joins me now from Paris. Ms. Moutet, while Macron is touring China at home, he faces what is probably the biggest challenge of his presidency. What is he doing to solve it?
What he is doing to solve it is basically hope that the protesters will tire of protesting before he gives up on the bill. It is not necessarily a good strategy. He sent his prime minister to talk with the unions, and there was a day of, there was supposed to be a day of talks with the unions the day before yesterday, and it ended up as a standoff after 1 hour of talks with the unions saying that it was impossible to talk with the Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, and the Prime Minister saying, well, we've talked for an hour and not 5 minutes, which is important. We've raised some important points. The Prime Minister is used to be the head of the Paris transport system, and therefore she has experience with negotiating with unions, but not at all in a nationwide setting. And she has done everything that probably she could do, but at the end of the day, the vision of the 64-year-old retirement age, has been seen as a limit that can't be crossed by both Emmanuel Macron, who doesn't want to stand down, and by the unions who say that that limit has got to disappear. And it's probably the way to get to a complete failure, because there are many aspects of that bill that could have been sort of raised instead of that, in terms of various conditions in which you could actually retire before, because you had a career that was physically difficult, because you started early, because you stopped to raise children, many things. But it's a standoff, and it's not looking like it's going to get better anytime soon.
Yeah, and Macron argues that this was absolutely necessary, doesn't he? The Constitutional Council will rule on the validity of this reform next week. How do you think this is going to play out?
On 14th of April, there will be a ruling from the Constitutional Council, and the likelihood is that they will not kill off the bill, but they will take provisions out of it. And there are people in Paris who say that some of those provisions were put there just so that the Constitutional Council would find something to get rid of. What the Constitutional Council is going to be faced with is a request from 270 MPs for a referendum in which both the population and enough MPs have made a request for. There's largely enough MPs, and it needs 5 million signatures in the country. Quite honestly, they have 9 months to gather those signatures, and they will gather much more than 5 million. You had 1.5 million people in the street. These people have families. It would be a complete failure, and it would be a protracted failure, because for 9 months that the process is going on, the bill is suspended. So I think, I don't see a good issue for the president, and I think the only thing he should do is withdraw the bill, because having 9 months of sort of, campaigning going on in the country while he's trying to get anything else done would be almost impossible.
Yeah, but these protests have become about much more than just a piece of legislation, haven't they?
Yes, the president introduced a bill that he talked about in his program, in his platform, during his re-election campaign. But he's introducing this at a time when we've been hit by a sort of strong inflation, the prospect of an economic crisis, because there's no way it won't happen, since all the economic balance has been upset by the war in Ukraine, and before that by the expenses of COVID. And so the real people are basically saying we are afraid. We are already bearing the brunt of the economic crisis because people say, oh, there's only 7% inflation in France, but that's if you take into account things like cars and computers, stuff that you can very well not buy every other day, and you can certainly sort of push back. And what people pay 30%, 40% more is for foodstuffs, i.e. stuff you need to buy every day, and for heating and electricity, which is also something you need every day. So there's a feeling of disconnect, and there's a feeling that the president does not listen to the people.
How has the opposition, and mainly far-right leader Marine Le Pen, who says she's a woman of the people, been seizing this moment then?
Well, Marine Le Pen, there's been a poll giving her as a clear winner of the runoff of a presidential election if it were held today. It doesn't mean, that she will win in 27, assuming Macron stays on. But it still is something that should worry everyone. And what she's done during this entire sequence is, in Parliament, is acting reasonable, saying what she disagreed with, saying there are areas of that bill that we can agree with, and being stateswoman-like. And she instructed her MPs not to sort of shout to come all with the men wearing ties and the women wearing jackets and, look like we are ready to govern party. And meanwhile, you had the hard right party, the coalition of NUPES under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and they shouted in Parliament, they interrupted speakers, they tabled about 20,000 amendments, knowing full well that that was basically a filibuster. And they've been saying, well, legitimacy is in the street, it is not in Parliament, which is seditious when you think about it and when you're in a parliamentary system. So we are in a real sort of political crisis in France. Legally, the president can do what he wants, but he's not going to have a good time after that.
Yeah, we have to wrap this up, but I do want to ask you if Macron can survive this politically.
Well, that's the question we all ask, and we're not sure. But even if he survives it, even if he brazens it out, even if he stays on, he's a lame duck, and he's going to be a lame duck for 4 years. And that really is not a comfortable situation to be in.
Journalist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, thank you so much for your time.